Okay, so this week we're gonna talk about mostly access control, but focusing on authentication and a little bit of authorization control in the enterprise environment. So it doesn't pop up. Okay. And you should be working on your assignment with while we're doing this, right? But let's talk about the first portion first, and then we'll go in depth with the question and answer. So credential management is important. I truly believe that security really boils down to access management. When it comes down to network systems or even server systems and user systems, bring your own devices and so on. So we'll take a look at different approaches, the benefits and the disadvantages of each integration or deployment for enterprise. These are the things that we commonly do, and then we can take a look at how we would better improve our enterprise environment or corporation type of architecture relating to access and authorization. So credential management is important. I think that we rely on passwords for most part since, I don't know, 30 or years or longer. But we really need to think about like how passwords are being maintained within the enterprise environment. So that means that when you create the password, you have to make sure that your password is secured, long enough, complex enough. We don't reuse the password, or a dictionary-based password is not recommended. And then how it's stored, and we want to make sure that it is encrypted. It is not in plain text, and we'll talk about like the requirements in that. And then how when we no longer need the password. So if we're looking at application and databases, you would have a column for username, a column for password, right? And when you're storing the password for, let's say, an online account, you need to make sure that it is encrypted for that particular column. So when the user create a username and password, that goes into a database table. And then when that user no longer exists, let's say that I ask for my account to be removed, or that account is no longer in use for 8, 9 months or a year, then we would need to be able to get rid of that particular account profile. That means that we have to go in and clean up. So, the behind the scene for cybersecurity people and the IT people is that we got to make sure that all of these things are intact. In the first question, it asks you, so what are some of the approaches in managing credential in enterprises? So one way, as we talked about, is to create, store, and destroy passwords securely, meaning that we have long, complex password that is, not containing any dictionary words. We got to encrypt the password when we store it. And then we also, have proper permission control on who can access that part of the database. And then when the user can, we would have to think about like how the user can reset the password, or when we get rid of the password. Another approach that you often see, and we use it here in our school, is the single sign-on. So SSO is commonly implemented everywhere. It's a way that you can log in once on one application, and it would allow you to utilize other application that requires your credential. So simply, I log on to, let's say, Outlook. I validate my identity by putting in the proper password. Then with that, my token, my security token, is then being passed across multiple applications. So we should require, and this is a practice, more of a recent practice compared to what we've seen in the last 10 years, is we would use multi-factor authentication. That means that, once I authenticate to Outlook, I would get a push notification saying that, this account was um, authenticate it to Outlook? Do you allow or disallow? So we'll talk about that approach. Or I will be able to use a PIN number or biometrics or something to be able to validate my identity along with the password for single sign-on. So in single sign-on, you want to make sure that there's a second level of validity in the identity. And ultimately, single sign-on just gives the user convenience, so that way the user doesn't have to log in 10 different interface to be able to access 10 different applications or systems. And it is a lot easier to use. So the implementation is really pushing for convenience and ease of use. Are you okay? Oh, okay.
Like 7 minutes.
Okay. All right, and then the third things that you often see in enterprise is that we want to implement some kind of repository, an app that store your password. So Microsoft has one, right? LastPass, there's other, and then if you're using iOS devices or Samsung devices, they have their own. So that would also relay back to the user preference on which application that can store. Now we have to think about, is that it's one repository, so it could be cloud-based, or it could be on that device. So how secure is it is really depending on that application or the cloud repository where your password is going to be stored. So it's saved that credential, and then you don't have to retype in the password, and it's definitely convenient. I use it, but can we say it's 100% secure? Nothing is 100% secure, right? We know that if we rely on a technology to save it, it's just a mean of convenience, but in time, you would see that there would be some problem. Like LastPass had some problem, and there were a lot of other application that face the same thing, because that's a single target for a lot of the attacker. I can just go in to that cloud database and be able to pull up whatever that was stored for every single user if I could reach it. And then you can also use Cloud Portal. I think the RCCD does some of this. I can log on to the student or the faculty or the staff portal to be able to access other apps, right? Like you can log on to your portal and be able to access Canvas or Outlook or any of the application of the resources that you need for that profile. And that is through a federated access management process. You can do this on your local server, or you can do it on a remote server, aka cloud server. So that allows you to authenticate to one, right, web interface, and then your credential is then being carried into other areas, other application, and so on. So this is convenient also. It's similar to the SSO approach, but you have to authenticate directly into the employee portal or the portal for your company. And then the last option here, the last approach is to implement some kind of hardware token. You often see that is USB based, where you plug that into the computer. It will generate some kind of time-based PIN value, and you put that in, and that allows you to access that computer. So a hardware key is good. It does have encryption, but we want to make sure that it has strong encryption algorithm. So that's important. And so all those subsection at the beginning part of the notes, I just summarize that and put it in as number 1. Do we have any questions? No questions? Okay. So in the next section, it talks about privileged access management. And we know that we learned the least privilege rule in how we would only grant a user or a group or a system the necessary permissions and rights to operate for, could be their role or based on the rule. So when we're looking at a user would start with the least privilege foundation for access. So on most use, from the time that I log into the computer to the time that I access application, right? I should not have higher privilege than what is needed for my job or for, based on my clearance. And we'll talk about the model. But in a privileged access management, it is an option for that particular user to be able to request, right, to submit an automated request, and and the system would then grant, and sometimes this can be a manual process, so they can request or check out an elevated credential for use. So for example, for that one time, this particular user wants to be able to generate reports on financial system, but for most of the time, this particular user is basically working on maybe account payable, like just sending out checks to pay invoices. So at the end of the month or every quarter, this particular user needs to generate some kind of report to look at, what has been paid out and what has been deposited into the account, for example. So in this case, we would use a privileged access management approach. And this should say periodic use. Sorry, but the user would then be accountable because it's still linked to their particular account. So on the logs, we would see that for that privilege that is elevated, we would be able to track the event and the action for that particular user, right? So if you go back and audit the account, you would see that the privileged user, the privileged access in that moment in time is for a particular purpose. So, and then you can also grant, permission with it on how you want objects like files and applications to be used with that privilege, right? We don't have to open everything up to full control. We can just limit it based on, what does elevation really mean? Maybe, write instead of read only. Maybe, execute instead of just write. So we can drill down on the single level of permission and also access rights to the system. Okay, so with that, so you can find the privileged access management information on page 2. And then we'll go into password policy. So password policy is very important. It really speaks to how we configure the level of password that can be used in our system and in the network. So it basically set the rules for the configuration. So you have to write this down as a document and then be able to implement it with, directory services, or authentication and authorization system, or the AAA server, to be able to control how password is used. So we want to make sure that it's long and it's complex. We want to make sure that it uses different character, upper, lowercase, so that's complex. And you can use, guidance and industry standards for that. So right now, I think the basis is 8 characters, right? Upper, lowercase. Now they're allowing a lot of different symbols. But in most websites now, depending on the compliance requirement, you would see that it might be longer, 12 characters or longer, right? And then we also want to implement multi-factor or dual factor authentication. So password policy, this is from Windows screenshot. You can see we can set the values in editing the group policy or your GPO. And then we want to enforce history. So they cannot reuse a certain number of old passwords, right? So what should be stated in the password policy? In your password policy, you should include rules for complex password, minimum length of password, that's at least 8 characters, password history or non-reusable passwords, minimum and maximum password age, so we can have it, that same password can be used for 30 days, a year, or, you know, and then the minimum is that they have to use that for at least a day before they change. A lot of the time you don't see the enforcement for the minimum, but more on the maximum. So we cannot have that same password. So people cannot keep that same password for many, many years, right? That's the whole point. It forces the user to change the password. And then multi-factor, that should be MFA, sorry. Multi-factor authentication technology. So you can use biometrics with the password, PIN with the password, email with the password, OPT code with passwords. And then we want to also implement account lockout requirements. So that way we don't get password brute force. So we can say 5 attempts on some web application, you see it 3 attempts, right? I pay my student loan, and if you can't remember your password after the 3rd try, it forces you to reset, or it you know, you get account lockout for 30 minutes or an hour or whatever. So account lockout require, you know, it really keeps us in reducing the risk of brute force. Okay. Or, you know, people keep reattempting different or wrong passwords until they get a success. Now, with password spraying, right, if you're using a script or a program to do that, all that does is it found a password for that one account. It's going to take that and plug it into other websites or other applications. And then if it's successful, right, so it's going to keep trying, and basically it's a loop that they write in the program itself. So it's going to keep trying until it's successful. So because people tend to use the same password over and over again across multiple applications or web applications. So with that, we need to go back and audit our password. Oops. So when you're auditing the password, basically you're checking to see if the password that the users are using meet the criteria of the policy. So ultimately, we're going to check for weak password, short, dictionary-based password, right? Non-complex password or simple password. Now, we can approach it several ways. If you have the password stored as plain text, which you shouldn't, you can check it against the dictionary list, right? You can check it for rules. But in the case where you have thousands and thousands of users, it becomes cumbersome or granular. So we would use 10 testing approach, like looking at dictionary attack, right? So dictionary attack is only effective depending on your word list. So if your word list is very long and you can do it with multiple languages, then if your word list is long and containing a lot of the dictionary words, then you would be more effective in checking, right? So if I have a simple dictionary word list, like just the common speaking words, I might not have everything. I might not be able to check effectively. So you can also download word lists from different repository. I know that for the application itself, it comes with a word list. So when you're doing pen testing, you can pen test everybody, all the user account. And this does take time because it basically enumerate through each of the password, and it's going to check for the characters that were used, or the common words. So it will try to match the word from your word list to their passwords. So even if people use profanity and things like that, if your word list doesn't contain profanity, then you won't have a match. Now, I think years ago, Microsoft used to have a tool called Microsoft Baseline Analyzer. It came with like Windows 7 and the prior Windows version, also server. Microsoft did away with Microsoft Baseline Analyzer. They they included it in, I think, like system performance and monitoring tool, but it doesn't really have the same functionality. So the MBSA back then, it first thing that it audits is the accounts inside the system that you're running and the analyzer on, and it's checking for weak passwords. So you do have application or security application that does that. But if you manually do it, you have to use a pen testing approach. And then ultimately, we want to see if the user needs training or we need to update password policy, right? You should. Um, Everybody needs training every so often, even security professional, right? So when you're storing the password, we should always start with the hash algorithm. And depending on the hash algorithm, so if you're using hash algorithm, so when you create a password in your system, when it stores that, it has a hash algorithm. Depending on the operating system or the application that you use, for most part, the OS is going to handle some of this because it's anything that goes on the storage, it generates a hash. So we can look at SHA-256 or SHA-256. At the least level, it's going to be MD5, and MD5 is breachable. So your hash algorithm is applied to the password that is stored. Now on the database, when you create a database, and let's say that I have a column called password, and that column contains password for all the users for my website, right? So we have to use database management console, whether you're using Microsoft SQL or MySQL, to be able to make sure that the hash algorithm that is implemented before we store the password. So when we say write the password to the database, basically it's going to put the passwords onto the database itself. Now, when you configure your group policy, you would see a reverse encryption option, right? Normally, we don't select this. It is there. Microsoft allows you to have it. You can configure it to enable, right? But normally it is disabled by default. So if I select allow reversible encryption of all the passwords on the server, that just means that the password is going to be stored in plain text. Now, why do we want plain text password? Well, older applications that was built in the past require password that is not encrypted. So if, let's say, the company had implemented some kind of application to check, I don't know, a customer account, and in order to use it, you have to have a plain text password. because it's just older, and back then they didn't really care much about password encryption. So that means that we have that option available, but it is a flaw if you enable reversible encryption. It is not secure, right? Anything that's in plain text, right? Someone can grab that password and be able to access that application. Do we have any questions? Yeah, so you don't have to do. Yeah, so go back to the terminal. And then you gotta go to, the CD, space. Is it media? Slash USB dash drive. It's like this. Dash.
Oh, yeah.
Your home, it's actually in your home, right? Yeah, so just do this command, ls space dash al and it's screenshot. Okay. You see it? ls space dash al.
Okay, let's see a picture of that.
You should be able to see the GZ file there. Just like how you saw it when you opened it earlier. Okay. Oops, sorry. Okay, so we cover auditing, reversible encryption. Now we'll talk about identity federation. So identity federation is just a way that we can integrate services through the cloud. So we can use a third-party tool that will allow the user to sign on once, and then they'll be able to access other application. Could be like related partner, vendors, things like that. So you don't have to manage multiple credential systems, right? So we would be able to federate it across other companies' application. And you do this in the Microsoft server environment, you would do this with Active Directory installed, and the service for it is called Active Directory Federation Services. It is a role or a feature that you install onto the server, and hopefully you'll be able to see that today. And so that means that we can incorporate what's called Security Association Markup Language, your SAML, which is a technology or a protocol that would allow us to use authentication from our directory services and carrying that over to other applications. So here's my answer for that. Oops. So for number 6, it says, explain the purpose of identity federation and organization. How can it be implemented on Windows Server? So identity federation allows the user to use single sign-on. So I only need to log in once on the company that I work for, and I should be able to access third-party application. So at RCCD here, we use it. I use it. So let's say I log on to my Outlook or my email, or the network, right? And then I should be able to access things like Concur, which is an application that we use to put in travel requests. But it's from another company, right? But it's gonna be able to pull all my travel information for approval, and it ties into the financial system. So in case there's travel costs, right, RCCD can reimburse me or pay me. I can also access Canvas. You guys see that, right? And you sign on to Outlook, which is your RCCD student account, and it ties to Canvas, which is a third-party application. And Canvas is part of school, but Canvas doesn't belong to just this district, right? Canvas is used across all community colleges. We just have, access to Canvas as a community college. There are so many other things, and you see it being implemented every day because it is an easy way. So for our district office, our IT district office, how they are able to integrate this is through the Identity Federation service. And you simply would have Active Directory already enabled, and then you would use the objects in your Active Directory, which is your user accounts, your group. So you have a user account in Active Directory, and it belongs to students group, right? And then I would be able to control that container or that account across my, the other applications. So you can set it up. Any question? And then in this section, it talks about transitive and direct trust. So when a server and a server is communicating, so let's say that I own, I have a domain controller called, I don't know, ubuy.com. And so under that, I would have a child domain controller or a subdomain controller or another server, right? That would be inheriting some of the things, right? Some of the configuration that you see. The example that they give here is, let's say that you have a company and that company have different location in the world, right? You might have corporate office in one city and other city would have like sales and other department or other branches. Okay, and you see that all the time, like Bank of America, right? Their hub is out of Dallas, Texas. And then you would have branches in Southern California, in Los Angeles or whatnot. So with that, what you see is that you would see separate domains that are being carried, but the corporate is going to be your root. That's at the highest, the top hierarchy. So when we're looking at this, right? This is, let's say that's their corporate office. That's going to be the root domain. And that root domain, let's say that we have other domains in other locations like France and Taiwan here. Whenever that the server replicates, so why does that matter? When an employee get hired, right? When they're onboarded, their account is created at the corporate office, right? HR, even if they get hired here, there's a direct trust. So it needs to sync from here to here and from here to there because they're gonna pay the employee, right? All your account payable systems and stuff refer to account access. The user gonna need to access applications and so on. So there's a direct trust between the parent domain or the root domain with the child domain. So that's a direct trust, okay? Whatever that's updated here gets updated at the corporate office, at the root. Whatever that's created here, right, can be pushed down. It can be inherited to the the subdomain. So if my corporate has the HR department here, I would be able to create the file, onboard the user, make that user account, and it gets replicated here so someone can log in Taipei, right? So that's a direct trust. But then you have a transitive trust that's at the same level. Let's say that if you have an employee that's working here, a manager that's working here, But then once in a while, they're gonna be able to go to France to be able to help another manager there. So what you can do is you can say, okay, with the transitive trust, it's not the same as this and this, right? It's not an inherent trust or a direct trust. What you would see is you can limit some access. So let's say that the manager from France is going to be able to get trained by the manager from Taiwan. So they have read access or they have limited access to the resources in the other location. But they are going to be treated as subdomains. So at an equivalent level, what you see is you're going to see transitive trust, where the user, they do have access in the other subdomain, but they are going to have limited access. Compared to a direct trust, whatever that we can configure here can get trickled down to the bottom. Like I can onboard people here and it gets carried over to the other location. You see? So to really better understand this, I think, if you take 40D, if they talk about that, or 40C, they go into, replication and creating a direct trust with domain controllers. So for the transitive and direct trust that can be implemented, transitive trust is established in a hierarchical structure. That means that top down, you're going to see that the parent or the root is going to be direct trust with the child. And this is really to create a set of boundaries for your account access in different locations. And so when you retire the domain, so let's say that I sell the company or I got rid of the France location, right? You have to remove the direct trust, right? Let's say that I sold that to another company. And so within the system, what we have to do is we have to detach or we have to remove the trust from an enterprise level. So when you're at the root domain, you're at top of the enterprise that get trusted down to the child and all the other subdomain. So the parent and the child domain have direct trust. We established that. When you have the same level, the child to child domains have transitive trust. So when you're controlling the privileges, it's really based on the trust type. And also we have to consider, the authentication and authorization based on access management model. So in transitive trust, I won't have the same access if I'm on the other domain, right? Child 1 and child 2. If I'm in the child 2, I won't have the same privileges as I'm with the other child 1 location. So if I'm in France, I as an employee, I won't be able to access Taiwan's data, right, compared to France data. It's different level of access. So within the domain, you have different privilege. And then when you're accessing other location, you see this. This is really to control, right, geographical resources ultimately in a corporate environment. Any question? So for Microsoft, by default, all your data is replicated. If you set it up, it's replicated every 60 minutes, right? We can force it to sync. So when you update whatever, like policy, whatever so when I change like password policy up here, let's say, it's going to trickle down to the other. So it takes an hour, right? If the connection allows, because there's some time lag in crossing across the world, right, to the other networks. But if we have like the direct trust, so if I change like from 8 characters to 12 characters an hour later, right? If the user sometime logs out and within that hour, when they log back in, their password might not be working if it has less character, right? So when you make those type of changes, you have to really consider like how that would affect with the direct trust. Now, in across the board for the transitive trust, you can limit their access or remove the access period. So let's say that you don't want the other location to have access to everything on the, from Taiwan. What you can do is you can just remove their permissions and privileges period. So you can do that at this level or across the level, okay? So normally, an enterprise administrator, they would do it here. So in a hierarchical structure, everything is, when you see here corporate and corporate control, they change everything from the root domain. But then there is some level of control at the local level, but very, just for the domain controller or the subdomain controller. They cannot control what's up here, and they cannot control at the other one. So in the transitive trust, you don't have an interchange up, and then you don't always have an interchange across. Okay. But in a centralized environment, the downfall on that is you rely on everything for the root domain. But yeah. So here, the text talk about how you can use things like IPsec and that use in VPN. You can set that up with authentication for remote access. And then to be able to control how the user can get access after they're authenticated. So in the next section, it goes over OpenID, and I know you see this every day. I use it all the time. I think it's a great technology. So basically, we rely on the identity provider like Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you name it. There's some of them out there, or even Slack, right? They offer OpenID, and your credential from these websites can be applied to other applications, right? So if you're trying to access these website, you can just use the credential that you have. So that way we don't create like 5 different passwords for 5 different things. You can, but you can still use just your Google account or your Facebook account or your Twitter account, which is definitely convenient. So what technology is used for user login? When the user log in a website using websites or social media credential, such as Google, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Slack, LinkedIn, etc. Right? That's known as OpenID version 2. And it basically is a cloud-based identity. And the Google, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, those are providers for the cloud-based identity. You can also use SAML and Shibboleth, which are just cloud portals. So similar to what you log into Google, if you already logged in, so SAML give you the opportunity to carry your credential from a cloud portal. So let's say a company's portal, like student portal here at RCCD, right? Your security token can be federated or sent to the other applications. And we'll talk about the technology behind that in a little bit. So OpenID access is here for SAML, right? This is open standard. You can implement it for your cloud-based portal. It does require IDP. So when you're using, the OpenID, you would also integrate SAML. You can do this for SSO, like what we talked about, accessing third-party applications. Microsoft allows SML to use for identity for 365 services. This technology actually has been around for a long time. It was integrated with Active Directory forever, right? Like I've taught Microsoft administration classes for, I don't know, 15 years plus now. And, but of recent, it actually went cloud because everything now we put on Azure, and Azure is just remote server administration, for other things like infrastructure, storage, etc. So your 365, Microsoft 365 simply is just now on a remote server. Note that it uses XML, and when you see this on a web environment, it's going to use JSON. So, and they claim that it's secure, but we know that security is really how you look at it and how you manage it over time. It's never 100% secure, right? So it really ties back down to attributes and how, and we'll talk about attribute model on how we would approach it. So it would look something like this. So you log in and then you're able to access your Microsoft Office, like Office 365 and other applications. So that's the whole point, right? I just need to authenticate to my web portal. And people do this for remote work. I think that it's so convenient. And it's nice. And you can also use, other approach like with OpenID. Yeah, so your token is sent to the service provider, and then that's how you're able to get access. This is known as a federation service. Okay, so let's go through and talk about access control model, right? I know that we harp about this in every security class, but we want to make sure that because every certification asks for it. So mandatory access control, an example of this is someone can get access to confidential data based on their background clearance, right? Or they can access classified data, military classified data based on their background clearance. And that's mandatory access control. Discretionary access control, whenever you see discretionary, you think about, I have a discretion because I own it, right? So the owner are the creator of the file. And owner creator can grant other users whatever level that he, she, they, it deem fit. So the owner of the file can grant the user access and groups permission to access file based on their discretion. Role-based access control that relies on the user role, and that could be job role. But the one that we see that comes with the system is the administrator. That user role has full control to everything. Or you see users, right? Users is a group. And when you create a user account, it adds it to authenticated users or the users group. And with the users group, there's limited access to system rights and also permissions. Then you have rule-based access control, and the easiest example for this is gonna be your firewall rule. I can block a certain IP address. I just set it as a rule. I can allow port 443 to access HTTPS because it's a rule, right? So we can set rule on how we block, allow, deny traffic, services, or port connection. Then you got attribute-based access control. You have users are granted access, granted or denied, we should say denied, access based on geographic location or their attributes. So like earlier, we looked at the Taiwan and the France example, we can definitely use an attribute-based access control there, right? If I'm an employee and I logged into France, so how can you know the geographic location? Public IP. Public IP tells you, right, where they are. Where else? Well, maybe we have to rely back on the domains that they're accessing. So if I don't know if you ventured out of the country and then when you go outside of the country and you're accessing, you know, maybe mobile network in another country and you're trying to load United States based website, right? Sometimes, you know, like in country that block certain content from United States, it doesn't load, right? So their firewall filter based on the rule, and also the rule is sets on attributes as well. So geographic location is often used quite a bit for access management. But attributes can mean other things like files, file attributes, system attributes. So think of attributes as just characteristics or something that would describe that object inside your infrastructure. Okay. So there's a section, pretty lengthy. I need to close this because I was helping him with the lab. On access control, right? Some screenshots. So you can go through it and look through the information again. I think also additional textbook really define this area well, like the Security Plus type of books is good. And then you have authentication and authorization protocol. Your remote authentication dial in user server, your radius. The reason why it has dial in the name is back in the day we use analog connection, so we have to dial in and then it would connect to that server. So whenever you remote access, you would do a dial in option. Now it is supported with the AAA protocol, which ties back to the VPN. So how can you implement this? For access management. Describe how access management is implemented for remote access and AAA servers in an enterprise network. So your remote users would authenticate via VPN connection, whether they're using web-based VPN connection or it would be company provided VPN connection. So in an enterprise environment, right, we would make VPN connection available to our users. And at that point, the VPN would pass the authentication request to the server that contained directory for the users, the groups, and the system. So this is how, now Radius does not do anything regarding to authentication. Basically, it is a middleman, right? It is a connection type of server. It passes the authentication. So the user would type in the username and password, let's say logging onto the portal, right? So they connect via VPN, and through the encrypted communication, they connect to this server, and this server connects you to the authentication server, which tells you whether you can, log into your domain or network or not for services, right? So the AAA server really contained the services, contain the users, the groups, and the systems, and it has directory services, aka Active Directory for Windows environment. If you're using Linux servers, that would just be a directory services. So it passes your authentication to the request to the AAA server. Then the AAA server checks and say, okay, well, you are allowed access. Then it gives you a token, a security token, and that gets passed back by the Radius server to your system. So it's purely for connectivity purposes. Now the implementation for Radius is with, so when you hear remote access server, that often is referred as RRAS, right? And that is just a role in the Windows server environment, but with that you have to configure Radius. I don't know when they're gonna do away with the dial-in. I guess eventually that will get fully phased out, but it's always been around like that since Windows 2000. Now, when you install Active Directory, you would incorporate this protocol, right? So when you install Active Directory, you would have Light Directory Access Protocol, which is known as LDAP. And LDAP allows access to directory services, which gives you the option to create a user account, a group, organizational units, system. So those are just objects in the directory that you would allow access on your network. So LDAP is used to administer directory services. Remember that it allows access to the directory. It is not a directory, okay? So basically it's a protocol that allows you access to that service. But the Active Directory itself is like a database or a container that has the accounts. So this protocol gives us access to a directory, and that directory would have accounts, groups, objects. People tend to lump this up with the directory itself, but it's a service for the directory. So when you think about Windows, so let's say a company, they interview you and they say, what can you tell me about Active Directory? Even if you don't manage it all the time, you don't use it all the time, you would say that, oh, it's integrated with lightweight directory access protocol. Active Directory can, is a directory where you can create user account, groups, objects for your server, your authentication server. And with that, when we create accounts and the accounts get authenticated, I just talk about this with my other class, yesterday class, because we touch a little bit on Kerberos when we do forensic. So Kerberos is used for authentication with this Windows system. And it can be used also for single sign-on because it's tied to authentication. Kerberos uses encryption. And Microsoft claims that Kerberos is very strong, right? Because without that, nobody would want to buy Windows OS. So it works with Windows Active Directory service. So when you go into Active Directory and you create a user account and you set a temporary password for that account, in that process, when you create a user account and password for authentication, you activated Kerberos. Okay. Now, in other servers like Linux, Red Hat, Oracle, or IBM directory services, you can incorporate Kerberos, but Windows operating system had used Kerberos for over 20 years. So it's more on like very native to Windows operating system. But it does exist in the other type of server. And this text doesn't really go in depth in the technology itself. I think Security Plus courses CIS27 address Kerberos. And then you've seen some of that, but with the configuration for Kerberos, it is defaulted for Windows because it's incorporated. But in the other server environment, you can configure for this protocol to be used with the directory service. It doesn't always come default. Now, OAuth is open authentication. This is a way that we can integrate, right, different type of authentication approach. Here, let me get to that section so you can. And it talks about diameter. I didn't really put this in the questions, but it's also good to learn about diameter. It's just a newer version of radius. But in Windows system, when you install it, still call it radius. So, and then your LDAP right here. So it talks about how you can use TLS. So LDAP uses port 389, where TLS uses different port 636. The reason why they put TLS here is because if it's through a web portal, you can, this is a way that we can encrypt the traffic for the web for authentication. And then your Kerberos here. You know that it's only used in the United States? Kind of funny because Windows Server is everywhere, but originally when they licensed this, look, protected export restriction to use within the United States, right? But you see that it's incorporated in Windows OSs, and Windows OSs are used everywhere in the world, right? So, and also Kerberos use when you install this service for authentication in your Windows Server system or your domain controller. So you can do it through this. We talked about this, right? So DNS, and then install Active Directory. You're gonna promote that your domain, your server into a domain controller, and then you are going to you have to install the roles KDC and TCS. So that means that you need a key distribution for encryption, and that's used for authentication, and then you have a ticket granting service. Okay, so here's OAuth. Now, OAuth allows single sign-on. You often see that, a similar thing where you can use OpenID to log into one of the websites and it brings your credential over. I think version 2 is where we're at. So if I don't know if you ever go on a website, let's say that you buy something. In this example, you buy, let's say that I go to booking.com and I reserve a hotel or buy a flight, or go to Kayak, right? When I go through and at the end, near the end of my transaction, I have to pay for my purchase. And to pay for my purchase, I can use PayPal, right? I can use Apple Pay, I can use Google Pay, Samsung Pay, I can use, or I can input a credit card, right? Let's say that I choose PayPal. So when that happens, it either asks you to log into PayPal, but if you already log on to PayPal, right? Or even your bank sometimes does this. It ties your login from PayPal back into the web application that you're making the purchase with, right? So it processed your transaction as part of the transaction for the purchase. So instead of, so basically you're using a third party, you're authenticating to that third party somewhere in the process later. But OpenID, you authenticate it at the beginning when you log on to your account. So there's a slight difference in those, right? OAuth really defines the flow of the request and the response to authorize the transaction. Like I said, I want to use PayPal to pay for my purchase near the end from booking.com. I book a hotel. I don't have a credit card, but I have a PayPal account that's tied to my checking. I would choose use PayPal, and it would take my credential from PayPal and plug it into booking.com, and it becomes an authorized transaction. Now, but when you're using OpenID, it is a role. It is an account role that, and it loads your profile based on whatever that you had from the other application. So it is a little bit different in sequence on how you use it. And basically OAuth is mostly used for request and response. So it's only going to be a session that's established for that transaction, that purchase, right? Like we said, PayPal to booking.com. There's so many options now. If you look back 10 years ago, you don't have that many options. You have to either put in your credit card number, or, you can mail in a check. Nobody mail in a check anymore, right? I guess a money order, some people still use it. I saw for the first time in a long time that someone was paying with a check at the grocery store the other day. And the clerk just didn't know what to do with it, because hardly anyone uses check or money order these days, right? But I mean, you can Zelle, and you see that with Zelle. OAuth is used with Zelle all the time. Yeah, you can pay for something, and then you can Zelle, like you can go to a website. Let's say you want to buy something from, what is that crafty website you can get, or eBay even. You can Zelle, you can. What's the one that got breached recently? There's Zelle. What's the other one that Cash App? So Cash App, I think, has a huge class action against them right now because of the data breach. And then I know Ticketmaster, they notified me of the breach. I was one of the people on their data sets that got lost. But yeah, I read a little bit about the Cash App issue. So, I mean, technology is gonna have flaws. So if you have Cash App, just check it out, be careful. Well, yeah, I mean, you can disable the account, and you have to contact them to actually remove your account, but it's already late. They had the leak like not too long ago, I wanna say earlier this year or something like that. Okay, so you kind of see how OAuth is used and then how OpenID is used. We see this every day, right, on our smartphone or when. We're almost done. We'll take a short break. We mentioned to publish your lab. We're gonna use Windows Server again today, so you can copy that onto the folder like we did last week onto your desktop. We'll have to do a little bit of Active Directory install, but I'm gonna try to get you to install the federated services. But I'm hoping that we can do, probably we're gonna get stuck somewhere, because if we don't have an account or a, well, we might be able to use a default group or something. Okay. All right, so we gotta look through here and we have to determine, is it multi-factor? Is it not multi-factor? Is it in-band authentication or not? So let's go through. Lori logged onto her online account using her fingerprint and PIN, right? You see this a lot now. I think most of the credit card companies allow you to use biometrics, which I love because I really hate passwords. And then, in the case that if you need additional validation, they require a PIN, which I don't really think PIN is that effective because, 9 digits, 10 digits 0 through 9, it can quickly be enumerated. But in the case that it does, right? So when you're using two-factor like this, it's called two-factor, 2FA. Something you know, something you have, something you are, right? Those things. So fingerprint is your characteristic, and then PIN is knowledge. Han logs on to his Google account on his work computer, which requires him to verify his identity on, I'm sorry, I should say through Google push notification on his smartphone. You do this, right? Sometimes you log on to a different system and it doesn't know that system. It's going to say, oh, you have to validate who you are, right? Tap the text message yes on your smartphone or whatever. So that's called a two-step verification. It is not multi-factor. So the people in the industry, they always say multi-factor, and then there are people who are not in the industry, they think it's multi-factor, but it is not multi-factor. So it is a two-step verification, even though you have that phone. It's one step is you log in with the password. The second step is you tap what you have. So they say that it is multi-factor, but it is two-step verification. Okay. Kayla logs into her bank account and her identity was verified using the browser on her computer. So in the case where it knows that system and it knows that application, then it's called in-band authentication. You ever log in and it says, save your credential for this system, right? That's an in-band authentication. So in the next time that you just go to that website and it remembers you, right? It remembers your login. That's an in-band authentication. It's not safe. Yeah, the session sometimes time out and it requires you to, re-log in with your password or whatever. But the people who keeps 50 tabs open all the time, wherever they go, right? In-band authentication, in-band authentication might not be good for that because when they go into public network, they still using, right, those websites, and those websites still open and, God knows what happens to their account, right? So Patrick logs on to his online account, requires him to verify his identity using a received text message with a numeric code that expires in 5 minutes. This is very common, right? It tells you you have 10 minutes to use this code. After that, expired, right? And it will tell you the date and the time. So it is a form of OTP, one-time passcode, but it is time-based. So whenever you have 30 seconds, 10 minutes, an hour, 5 minutes, those are time-based. So it gives you that expiration time. So it's called out-of-band authentication with TOTP. It still requires something you have, and that could be email or text, right? You know, so this is an integration. Now that's the common practice. This is what you see. 10 years from now, it might be AI verifying you. So it's already probably AI verifying you in the back. It's all automated in the back anyway. So okay, so go through and we're going to look at these technologies. So this is the last part of the note. This week notes is pretty light. So a hardware root trust, we have this on our system now, like TPN. Basically, it's a module that's integrated with your processor that have that trust. So what does this do? Well, it really is, this is not on your notes. I borrowed this from other websites because it just sounds so much better. It generates and protects store keys that is used for encryption. And because encryption would be integrated as part of the boot process for the software. So with the TPM, right, the protected module is really a module that can generate keys, like encryption keys, and it would store and secure the keys. So when you boot your system, it becomes a secure boot process. This is a way to protect your system from a hardware level. And it works directly with your operating system. So, you know, so we want, even on the low level, at the processor level, we have that trust. Now, earlier we talked about OpenID and OAuth, right? The technology behind it is JSON Web Trust. This is how we're able to pass your credential or your login from one application to the next, from the client to the server. So basically it encoded with JSON for signature, and this part is gonna be your authentication mechanism. So let's say that I don't want to type everything in, so I basically pass the credential. Well, it is a way that saying that, oh, this is the signature from Google or from Facebook, and it's being passed on to the next application to validate instead of the username and the password, right? So this is a way that you can share information across application. So OAuth can be integrated as an API, which is an application interface. It's a program that would work with your login web page. And then the same thing with OpenID. So this is why you see it widely used, because it's really easy to integrate from a development level. So in the back, it uses JWT. So when you learn the technology, you always have to see how they break the technology, right? So if JSON is used to pass the authentication mechanism or the signature for that, right? I have to look further into the documentation of this, then I want to explore this part on JSON. Right? So if you want to pen test it, you want to probably, you know, the application that uses OpenID and OAuth, you want to learn about more about these technology and this technology. Okay. Questions? Okay. Getting that. That's it. Let me stop recording. So I have the lecture.